welcome to this OCF roundtable on the marine priorities for a new UK government. I'm Dickon Howell. I'm Director of OCF and also HMC, where some of you may know me from. We're going to have a really interesting discussion today. We've got some great guests to talk about what our potential futures might be over the next 5 years. Before we get into that, I just want to do some housekeeping. So this event is scheduled to end at 1:30. The format here, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview and an introduction to the manifestos. I've drawn that short straw. And then we're going to have a general question on our guests' aspirations and priorities for the next 5 years. Following that, we're going to have discussion across 4 themes: environment, net zero, fisheries, and coastal communities. It's worth noting there's no chat function. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button. If your question is for one person, please include their name in the question. It will really help me know who you want to answer. If your question is for everyone, please let us know that. And as mentioned, we're going to have 4 themes in our discussion: environment, net zero, fisheries, and coastal communities. So if you could also indicate which theme your question might be relevant to, that would be super useful. You can ask questions anonymously if you like, and you can thumb up other questions so we can see which ones are more popular. Questions are being moderated, and we probably won't have time to work through everything submitted. And again, I've drawn the short straw of trying to pull out those questions that are relevant to the discussion we're having at that moment in time. So again, if you're thinking about we're coming into a discussion about environment, we get those environment questions in, that would be great. Thank you. So here we are. We've got a general election in less than a month. And we'll probably have a new government. We will definitely have a new government of whatever colour, whether that's blue, red, yellow, green, in 4 weeks. So interestingly, for me, this election feels much more significant than almost any democratic event in the UK since the referendum in 2016. Potentially up there with 1997, obviously, when Labour came in after a lot of after many years of Tories, or 1979 when the Tories came in after years of Labour. And it's worth considering why this is. We've been through several global events that have changed our nation in the last decade. We've left the EU, and we've been through both a global pandemic and a global energy crisis, which have sparked recession and personal financial hardship in many of our communities. There's no denying that our current situation isn't one we'd want to be in. We have a series of crises in front of us: climate, biodiversity, cost of living. Our UK marine strategy indicators of good environmental status are going the wrong way. Of the 15 measured at the last assessment, 6 were failing, 5 were partially achieved, and only 4 were fully achieved. It's about a quarter. There's national uproar about the amount of sewage polluting our waterways. Coastal communities are facing increasing levels of deprivation, and energy prices are the highest they've ever been. Underneath all this, the amount of carbon in our atmosphere is increasing day by day. And we're seeing the effects of climate change in front of our eyes, affecting biodiversity, our economy, and our coast. Over the last couple of years, there's been lots of talk about this policy trilemma. How do we deliver net zero offshore, meet our targets for biodiversity restoration, and at the same time maintain a thriving and sustainable fishing industry and coastal communities? There's no doubt that government has to take action. However, an Institute for Government study on the state of public services released last week stated, and I quote, "Most services are performing worse than at the start of the 2019 Parliament and substantially worse than in 2010. Whoever forms the next government will have to grapple with the distinct challenges facing each public service, as well as their often shared and systemic causes." So there's a challenge here. And what I'm going to talk about now is how the different parties are proposing to respond to that challenge. Before I do so, I want everyone to bear in mind that environment is devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but energy isn't. We also don't have manifestos for the SNP and Plaid Cymru. So my apologies for that. The information we've got on them is a lot thinner on the ground. It's worth thinking about what state the parties are in at the moment. They're all in a really different place than they were 5 years ago. We're on our 4th Conservative Prime Minister since 2017. The Labour Party has gone over to the left and then back to the centre ground in what some people have described as being a fairly ruthless, but others a pragmatic way. The Lib Dems have been out in the political wilderness, but are looking to have a resurgence, hoping for another 2010. The Greens have lost their incredibly effective leader in Caroline Lucas and are looking to remodel themselves for a new generation. The SNP have been in a bit of a meltdown themselves over the last 6 months with the exit of Nicola Sturgeon and the collapse of the Butte House Agreement. And we have the rise of reform, pushing the political conversation ever further to the right, with one poll yesterday showing them above the Conservatives for the first time. So now we're going to talk about manifestos, but for those of you that aren't complete political geeks like I tend to be, it's just worth thinking about what a manifesto is. So manifesto are the pledges that parties are making to the electorate, and they form that programme of government when the party who is successful at a general election comes into power. Generally, things in a manifesto, when they go to a vote in the House, will be backed by all the party MPs, and they generally won't be blocked in the Lords because they're seen as having the highest democratic mandate because they formed the basis of a general election victory. So, across the parties, what are we seeing? The Conservatives. So the Conservative manifesto is pretty much the same as their current programme of government, which we're all probably familiar with. Rishi Sunak, in the launch of the manifesto a couple of days ago, re-emphasised that the Conservatives won't be eco-zealots and they want a pragmatic approach to net zero. So what does that mean? Well, they want to treble our offshore wind capacity. They want to have annual licensing rounds for oil and gas production and new gas power plants. They want to reform the Climate Change Committee, giving it a mandate to consider cost to households and UK energy security in their future climate advice. There's no real mention of marine protection other than overseas, but they do want to speed up the average time it takes to sign off major infrastructure projects from 4 years to 1. And that's something that they've been wanting to do over the last 5 years. In terms of fishing, they've said they want to seek opportunities to back the inshore fleet when making marine planning decisions and in EU negotiations, but there's no further detail on that. And on coastal communities, they want to launch a Seaside Heritage Fund and recognise the unique circumstances of coastal areas in the allocation of grant funding to local authorities. So that's the Tories. So what do Labour want? Labour wants change. It's the word you'll be hearing a lot from Labour. And I heard a political commentator say the other day that by change, what they mean is stability. They have an overriding focus on growth. And the reason for that is to fund the shortfall in public services that the Institute for Government was talking about earlier this week. They want clean energy by 2030 through a green prosperity plan, and they'll invest in the industries of the future through a national wealth fund and a new Energy Independence Act. They've pledged no new licences for oil and gas or coal, and they'll ban fracking for good. They want to create a new publicly owned company, Great British Energy, funded with 8.3 billion over the next Parliament. Internationally, they want to create a new Clean Power Alliance, which is a coalition of countries at the cutting edge of climate action. At home and around environment, they want to put failing water companies under special measures and give regulators new powers to block the payment of bonuses and bring criminal charges. They don't say a huge amount about changing the current environmental targets. They say they're going to tackle the nature emergency, including pollution, and improve access to nature, promote biodiversity and protect our landscapes and wildlife, but nothing much more than that. And there's nothing on fishing or coastal communities specifically. The Lib Dems, well, you may have seen Ed Davey on Windermere talking about how polluted the water is before falling in. And that focus on environment goes back through their manifesto. They've got a general duty of care for the environment they would like to introduce. They also want to introduce a strategic land and sea use framework to effectively balance competing demands on our land and oceans, including grid, as well as a net zero delivery authority to deliver net zero by 2045. They want to give local environment groups a place on water companies' boards, which will be interesting. Require business to publish nature positive transition plans and introduce nature related financial disclosure requirements, create a real network of marine protected areas and ensure that sustainability lies at the heart of fisheries policy, including a ban on bottom trawling in MPAs. They also want to have fishers, scientists and conservationists at the centre of a decentralised and regionalised fisheries management system. And there is a focus on creating and restoring habitats like salt marsh, mudflat and seagrass to guard against coastal flooding and erosion, and absorb carbon emissions, as well as new blue carbon standards. The main difference that the Lib Dems have from the other two parties is they've explicitly said they would aim to place the UK-EU relationship on a more formal and stable footing by rejoining the single market. So then the smaller parties. So the Greens, on energy, they've said they want wind to provide around 70% of the UK's electricity by 2030 with 80 gigawatts of offshore wind, no new oil and gas licenses and the ending of all subsidies to the oil and gas industries. They want to bring the Crown Estate into public ownership and open more coastal waters for offshore wind and marine energy. And then on the environment, they want to introduce a new Rights for Nature Act, giving legal personhood to nature, and set aside 30% of our land and seas by 2030, in which nature will receive the highest priority and protection, and take the water companies back into public ownership. There's nothing really on fishing or coastal communities in their manifestos. As I said, Plaid Cymru and SNP, we don't have manifestos, but Plaid generally want energy independence for Wales and to remove the 350 megawatt ceiling for planning decisions on energy infrastructure. They want to devolve the Crown Estate to create a sovereign wealth fund and take power from the UK over the licensing of sewage. The SNP, sort of even less information, particularly now they've come out of the Butte House Agreement. They want independence. They want an end to austerity and they want to reverse Brexit, but it's very difficult to get any more information than that at the moment. And now to the slight elephant in the room, reform. Reform's interesting. It's a tale of two halves, I think, for what we want to talk about. There is, in the energy environment section of their manifesto, there's nothing about environment. It's all about energy. And there's lots of the old tropes about climate science attempting to debunk climate change. They want to scrap net zero and renewable energy subsidies and fast track licenses of North Sea oil and gas. They want to introduce fracking on land and lithium mining. But their fisheries section is a bit more considered. They want to put fishing at the heart of their strategy for regenerating coastal communities. They want to end automatic access for EU vessels, increase compliance by expanding naval patrol squadrons, and create a sovereign wealth coastal fund from foreign fishing licenses. So that's a lot of information there, and I'm really pleased I managed to get through it in 15 minutes. I'd now like to invite our guests to turn their cameras on, if we could. Excellent. It's good to see you all. Perfect. And Hannah, if you could spotlight us all, we're all coming up on the screen. That's totally brilliant. Okay, so we have a really great panel today. We've got Peter Barham, who is chair of the Seabed User and Developer Group. We've got Katie Jo Luxton, who is the Global Conservation Director at RSPB. Beccy MacDonald-Lofts, who's the lead officer of the Local Government Association Coastal Special Interest Group. Ben Sykes, who's Vice President, Head of Environment, Consenting and External Affairs at the offshore wind company Ørsted, and industry sponsor of the Offshore Wind Industry Council. And Rob Clark, who's the Chief Officer at the Association of Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities. Now, it's worth saying, as we have our discussion today, some of our panelists can't comment on individual manifestos, either because they're from a charity and the Charity Act prevents them from doing that, or they're from a public body, in which case they're in that period commonly known as PERDA, where they can't comment on the views of any political party. So we're going to steer away a little bit from discussion on either fully critiquing or cheerleading individual parties and think about, what do we, as people who spend our lives in and around the ocean and the coast, want for the next 5 years? What are our aspirations and priorities? So I've talked quite a lot now, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us up to 5 minutes. You don't need to be 5 minutes if you don't want to, because we're going to have lots of discussion through the day on what are your aspirations and priorities for the next 5 years. And I'm going to ask Peter Barham to talk first. Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Dickon. Mike's off. Mic's on, camera's on. Yeah, everything's fine. Firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. I think this is a really excellent idea, by the way. And the second thing I'd say is that you've already made a couple of important points, which is, although we're not a charity and although we're definitely not a public body, the SUDG is also not a political forum. Therefore, I will not be giving political views. So thank you for emphasising that. But for those of you who don't know the Seabed Use Developer Group, very briefly, it's a members only body. It's very much trade groups, so the ports industry, subsea cables, offshore energy, renewable UK, energy UK, the recreation sector, and aggregates. So very much marine industries. We still have no constitution. We're a loose affiliation, and that's the way we like it to be. But we work by consensus. We are committed, all members are committed to sustainable development, and by that I mean protection of the environment as well as economic growth. Over the years, we've carried out a number of socio-economic evaluations of the benefits of marine industries, and you've mentioned coastal communities a couple of times, Dickon. There are something like 1 million people whose jobs depend on marine industries. So, you know, SUDG makes a huge contribution to coastal communities. It's more than just fisheries, put it that way, although fisheries is important, as Rob's going to tell us later on. I don't really, you know, you say talk about priorities. I would say goals, what we would like to see in the next 5 years. But undermining or underlining all of that, or emphasizing all of that, is the fact that we have, as you rightly said, a climate crisis and we have a biodiversity crisis. And industry can and should play a major part in addressing both those. And I mean both those, not just net zero, which obviously Benj will talk about. But if I was to summarize things before I go to say a few words just specifically about strategy, priorities or goals, it's the one thing that I've learned and my members learned is over the years is if we're going to come up with the ways of doing things, we're going to do it in partnership. You know, this is not by working in silos. It's about understanding what each of us wants to see in the marine environment, working together to agree goals. We've got, you know, as SUDG, we've got a great relationships with the RSPB, wildlife trusts, WCL, etc. You know, we've produced shared objectives before now, and we're going to continue to try and do that, and I'm sure that we'll succeed. So it's making sure that if we're going to manage the environment, the marine environment properly, it's that we do so through working in partnership, and importantly, and I think this is probably one of the most important things, in doing so, recognising that the marine environment needs to be managed on an ecosystem basis. This is not like the terrestrial environment where you can have a bit of ancient woodland or rich grassland or cornfields. This is about managing an ecosystem, and we have to do that if we're going to be successful. So we need things like strategic targets for net gain. I personally believe we need protective legislation. We've got protective legislation. It's very good. It's been in place for 30, 40, 50 years. But I think we're starting to see legislation targeted towards restoration. And I think that's right and proper. I think we need to actually do more to restore the environment and not just rely on protection to achieve that. But I equally think that restoring legislation should apply to everybody and not just industry. It should apply to public services, people, organisations, everybody. I've even gone as far to say that I'm not sure that we don't need an actual agency for driving restoration. Debate on that one. 4 specific areas, I'll be very brief. 4 specific areas. As I've said already, we need to create a holistic shared vision. These are overused words, but they do apply to the marine environment. I believe that we need science to support that. And I am a very big fan of OWEC, Offshore Wind Industry Evidence for Change, for example, which I think is a superb way of trying to deal with this. But there are other marine science as well, which we should be using. I've already said we need the ecosystem approach, and I've already said we need to work together. I'd emphasise that quite a lot of this is already happening, but we may need to do more. Well, in fact, we do need to do more. And I think we also need to be very much outcome oriented. We need to have clear targets to look for. So that's my first point. The second is that I still think, and we still think, that there are opportunities to streamline legislation. That doesn't mean to say we need to reduce environmental standards and outcomes. We just need to make sure we've got better understanding of standards and protocols that could be applied. We still have huge opportunities for applying good practice to the way the industry does its work, and how those good practices could be accepted in the regulatory process. I think we need to reflect more on the scale of potential impacts and applying a bit more risk-based approach to some of the decisions there. And I think we may need to be overall a bit more less risk averse, and say, well, let's try things and see how successful they are, rather than being completely precautionary all the time. And that really sort of segues into my third point, which is that if we're going to improve ecosystems, we're going to need really robust, simple approaches, whether that applies to strategic compensation supplied by industry or net gain duties. They've got to be simple, they've got to be robust, and from our perspective, or certainly from my perspective, they've got to deliver agreed targets. And hopefully most of you will have a look at the work that we've done with the RSPB, Wildlife Trust, etc., with OWIC funding, to develop some of those strategic targets for net gain, which I think are so important. And are based, Dickon, on your point about the failures within the GES, and the fact that we have this recognised failure in the marine environment. My final point on that one, and then I've nearly finished, is that this is the early days for restoration. We don't know a lot about how to do restoration. We need innovation, and we need to accept that innovation needs to be applied and approved from a regulatory point of view. My fourth point, my last point, is in line with what you're saying. We need public services that have got sufficient capacity and expertise in order to be able to work with industry in constructive ways. That is absolutely essential. We all recognise that cuts in public services don't benefit anybody, but we need expertise and we need efficiency as well as resources. I've finished. One last thing. We need much more power and energy to improve the environment, and will improve the economy if we do. Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too long.
It's okay, Pete. You're the master at finishing and not finishing, which is like, we've known each other for 15 years, and that's fine. It's really, really great. Thanks. And I think that comment about public services having sufficient capacity is going to come up again and again and again and again. Katie Jo, over to you.
Hi there, can you hear me? Is that working?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So just to introduce myself, I'm Katie Jo Luxton. I'm the Exec Director for Global Conservation in the RSPB. I see in this debate, we're quite often the voice for nature in the marine environment. And that's primarily because seabirds are such great indicators of the health of the environment. And I wish I could tell you that they were doing great, but they're not. So I think one of the key points for us is we are talking about a very crowded, very pressured marine environment already that is already significantly degraded. So looking at how we fit much more development into this environment and bring about recovery is the big challenge. And the other thing I quite often find myself having to be the voice that raises in these discussions is that seas don't, and our wildlife doesn't respect the international country borders, and our marine ecosystems tend to cross many borders. And so we need to work in a very collaborative way, not just between sectors, but between countries as well. And in fact, the wind industry has been very good at that as well, because many of those industries are not based in the UK, but increasingly we as conservationists are working more collaboratively across marine borders. So you asked us, what were our aspirations? And I want to go further than that, because I think we can't just aspire, we must achieve a change here. We've got this joint climate and nature emergency, yet increasingly, and if you look at the political parties' manifestos, I think most of them prioritise response to net zero. And that is really important, but it needs to be done hand in hand with tackling the climate crisis together. So what I dream of and what I'm aiming for is this turbocharged energy transition that enables us to meet net zero, and we're not currently on track at all. And that we do that in a way that catalyses a fundamentally different approach that builds in biodiversity recovery and ecosystem resilience. So when Peter is saying, you know, we need to take a less precautionary approach and take more risk, I think that's much easier for us to do if you front load nature into the debate, because then we have more confidence rather than looking at this very degraded environment that's really fragile. So my number one priority is really that the political parties and whoever's in government embraces nature on a par with climate as a joint challenge, that we don't end up trading off between each other, that we all rise to this as a joint challenge. And how do we do that? Well, I think there's two really big pieces of the puzzle that government has to own and drive. The first one is effective marine spatial planning, and that has to be around tackling all these fragmented sectorial approaches that don't fit together in a really robust approach, and bringing in all the data, including environmental data from the start, rather than often the environmental data is brought in at the end. And maybe people will be surprised to know that none of our data around where seabirds forage at sea is currently included in where we're selecting wind farm locations. So we're setting ourselves up for some really big challenges. So we need to make sure that our spatial planning approach is tackled. And then alongside that, we need a really robust approach to marine spatial planning. And that needs to put nature recovery on a par with net zero, as I've said. So if we want to fit in significantly more offshore wind, which we fundamentally support because it's the only way we're going to meet net zero, we need to do that in a way that is also looking for space for nature. And that will mean more new protected areas, so greater expanse of the sea being protected for nature. And it will mean some tough conversations about which pressures that are currently existing in the marine environment are removed. And that's why we were so pleased to see the UK and the Scottish government coming together to close the industrial sand eel fisheries in the North Sea and Scottish waters. And we really hope that the EU challenge to that is not successful. You know, we need those sand eels to be feeding our seabirds rather than Danish bacon, frankly. And then the final one for these kind of high level priorities we need to see, I think, is really one around the evidence base and the transparency of data sharing. And that needs to be not just in the UK, it needs to be cross-border with our partners and neighbours in the EU. And we need to do that in a robust and coordinated way. At the moment, we're encountering lots of challenges sharing data because of commercial confidentiality. Other countries have put this through systems where the government owns the data being collected around developments, and that's a requirement of consents. And we think that could really, really help making sure we're all working from the same evidence base. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Katie Jo. Do you know what, as you were talking, there's some really important points about effective spatial planning and cumulative effects assessment and understanding our environment. None of which anything you've or Peter said, or no doubt anyone else is going to say, I think is technically out of our reach at the moment. It's about political will and capacity a lot of the time, potentially. Beccy, I'm going to ask you to go next. Take us to the coast.
Well, hopefully this will work. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, just checking because my laptop crashed, so I'm now on my phone, so apologies. All the joy. So hello everyone, thank you for letting me join you today. So my name is Beccy MacDonald-Lofts and I'm the lead officer for the local government association Coastal Special Interest Group, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we tend to be known as just the Coastal SIG, and we have a membership of 58 coastal local authorities. And we work in collaboration with lots of other partners, including through the One Coast Coalition. And I know some of those are on this call today. So it's really great to have the One Coast Coalition and bring different voices together for coastal communities. So we're very lucky that we look not just from a local authority perspective, but through that narrative, we're able to talk to those within the environment sector. We can also talk to those within heritage, tourism, economy, fisheries, all sorts. So that's what we try and do. And I think that's been put up already by both Peter and Katie Jo about collaboration, working together, and that really being the message for success for coastal communities. So being asked to come up with some priorities, there's so many that we have. So I've sort of tried to whittle them down, and I've been noting down what everyone else has said so that I don't repeat the same sort of points. So really, in terms of coastal communities, from a local authority perspective, is really that we need to change the narrative. Coast and marine is always seen as difficult and on the periphery, and therefore there's too many challenges. But it's not, it's a gateway to opportunity. And we really need people to start valuing our coast and really understanding what it brings to us, what the benefits are. If I asked you all to just close your eyes for 1 second and think of the coast, a lot of you will feel instantly better because it has that blue well-being impact. But do we value that? Do we truly appreciate what our coast brings? From our sort of local authorities sort of view, we see things through the lens of health, but we see it through deprivation, environment, water quality, safety, tourism, all these different aspects. And we're really proud that a number of our councils are taking part in some really innovative programs and projects to really see how we can bring nature-based solutions into communities to really change how we see this. And it was quite rightly brought up at Southern Coast last week that we have this sort of militarian approach to the coast. So it's all hold the line, defence, retreat, all the, it's really interesting when you look at the actual language being used. We're not at war with the sea. We've loved it and taken part of it. It is part of our culture and our heritage, all the way back since people have been here. So we really need to start to engage with it and reconnect with it. We also see that in our own coastal communities, there is a disparity, not just with health and wealth, but also their view of the coast. And we need to change that narrative. There's what we call the 1 mile barrier. You tend to find that young children who are a mile away from the coast have never been to the coast, which sounds absolutely ludicrous, but it is seen as the place that the posh people go, where they get the money to enjoy their holidays. That's not the narrative that we should see. We want to see the narrative change and really for people to undertake a sort of complete change in approach to see things going further forward. We see issues around funding formulas where you can regenerate a coastal community, but you can't use that money to help with coastal protection and management. The two things must go hand in hand. And, Peter rightly said about siloing. We've got to break those silos down. Everything on the coast is interconnected. Health is interconnected with nature. It's interconnected with the possibilities around energy, skills and aspirations, environment. We've really got to change that sort of narrative. And we're at a point now where we really could see that happen. One of the things we really champion for is for a coastal minister. And a lot of people aren't really sure what that means and why we would want a coastal minister. The reason is we want somebody who has that view of all those different areas. So we stop education being just education by itself, energy buying by itself, environment by itself, but having a minister with overview of all these different aspects with an interdepartmental task force who would help support that narrative. And that would also help with those funding formulas. It's a really difficult situation where we've got things like coastal landfill as a really difficult thing that is not really understood. And, there's potentially 1,200 sites, 75% of which could be next to designated areas that are at risk. But we can't find the right funding formula because of where pots of money lie in different governmental departments. So we need to see a change to that as well. It's great to see that the manifestos, each one has its own little sort of viewpoint on where coast falls in. but we really need to see that wider change, proper funding for local authorities and support. Quite often, local authorities are the ones that people first go to about the challenges, particularly around coastal erosion. If you're going to lose your house, flooding, there's lots of funding, but if you're going to lose your house to the sea, it's not the case. We need to really have big, strong conversations about rollback, about what's going to happen with some of our communities. You know, all these different things are happening, and I know we're going to have lots of discussions, so I'll stop there. Thanks, Dickon.
Thank you, Becky. Benj, I'm going to come to you next.
Thanks very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Great to have this opportunity to speak, and going forth, I think I am. Of course, a lot has already been said, so I will do my best to be less than, I'll be reasonably brief. I think to your question, Howell, Dickon, I think, to be honest, I think for me that I start with what does good look like in 2029, assuming whoever comes into government will be around for 5 years before they have to re-win their mandate. And I've got 3 things: thriving coastal communities, and Becky, you really set out very clearly and very passionately what that means. Secondly, a marine environment that's turned a corner and is returning to good health. Katie Jo, you've touched on that very clearly as well. And thirdly, accelerated action on tackling climate change. I would say that, of course, as an offshore wind developer and as a representative of the industry, but also because of the interaction between climate change and nature, as you've mentioned, Peter. So I think for me, that sets, if you like, the guiding star: stronger coastal communities, an environment that perhaps in 5 years' time won't be thriving, but at least has turned a corner, is on the pathway to being a strong, thriving, restored environment, and faster action on climate change. And for me, it all comes down to acceleration around how government works, acceleration around the mechanisms that are being put in place. Great that they're being put in place by the government that's just ended, but it's woefully too slow. So I think for me, if I want just drill into some of the details, and I will be brief because I'm going to talk about some of this when we get onto the net zero question, Dickon. Spatial planning. We've got the strategic spatial energy plan. I was going to say we've got it coming, but we've had it talked about, and I think that has to be accelerated. We need to see that moving forward much more quickly. As you've said, Katie Jo, it's got to embrace the environmental data that we have, but also the environmental ambitions that I think we all share. And alongside that is the tough decision making around prioritisation of our marine space. There's no doubt that there is good work going on this. It's too slow and it's too fragmented, and we all like to talk about collaboration, don't we? But I would really want to emphasise to the next government the importance of working across Westminster and the devolved administrations. That isn't working as well as it needs to if we're going to get the pace of change and pace of improvement that we need in our marine environment. It's not going to deliver the pace of offshore wind and the energy transition that both we as a planet, but also the environment in our marine space need so urgently. But within Whitehall, we need to see better engagement and collaboration across the Department for Energy and Net Zero, DEFRA, DLUC, and other departments, Department for Transport. There is an awful lot that needs to be happening across those pieces. And one of the things I would really like to see is the emergence of some sort of overarching guide, whether that sits in cabinet or wherever. I'm not fussed, but we need something that brings together those departmental and devolved administration objectives into one much more coherent programme. Getting into more detail, the offshore wind environmental improvement package that DEFRA is leading on, all good stuff, but it's too slow, it's too fragmented. The Marine Recovery Fund in particular is something I'll talk about in a moment. It's super urgent. We really do need to deliver that, or have that delivered, so that we can use that. And we need to get much smarter about coexistence. And I think that really does come down to how government behaves. We have many different interests represented in this call. I think we all represent the environment, but we also represent, many of us, different industries, Peter covering pretty much all of them. But there's no doubt that if we cannot come together and find a coherent and synthesized view of how human use of the seas is prioritized so that we can all crack on, to the extent that that's possible whilst we improve the environment, we're not going to make progress. So for me, that coexistence piece, and I think it's about smart coexistence. It's not just saying you do this here, you do that there, but it's much more nuanced and science-based about how we can coexist, as well as having there are always going to have to be areas that we leave for nature, and the 30 by 30 piece is a big part of that. But I do believe that an enlightened approach by government can give us a lot more intelligent use of the marine space that we're blessed with in the UK. I'm actually going to stop there, if that's all right, Dickon, because quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about will come in later parts of this session.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Benj. And Rob, thank you for waiting patiently. It'd be really interesting to hear your views as well.
Thank you ever so much, Dickon, and thank you CMS for providing this opportunity. I'm Rob Clark and I work for the Association of Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities. That's the organisation that represents the 10 IFCAs in England. IFCAs manage our coastal fisheries, and we're charged with the sustainable management of marine protected areas, protecting them from the damage that fisheries can cause where not properly managed. The IFCAs are committees or joint committees of local government, and therefore I'm going to completely support what Becky's already said before me about the role thereof of local authorities in that process. Our members come from a wide range of backgrounds, including local councillors. It's the local authorities that fund the IFCAs, but members also come from the Marine Management Organisation, Environment Agency and Natural England, as well as people appointed for their skills, knowledge of the marine environment, including fishermen themselves. And I'll come back to the importance of that, because that sort of comes to the key point that I'd like to raise about the importance of bringing local communities into decision making. So I've been asked to say a few words about our aspiration and priorities for the next 5 years. Well, we have a new Fisheries Act in England. We're in the UK, and that brings about fisheries management plans. Fisheries management plans are a vehicle for the achievement of sustainable fisheries management in the UK. Fisheries management plans, or FMPs, can improve how we manage fisheries and stock shared with other coastal states. There are a number of challenges that represents. Without adequate investment, implementation and the effectiveness of FMPs will not be adequately addressed. These challenges represent the opportunities, and over the next 5 years, we need to address significant evidence gaps in some of our key fisheries. We need to improve the coordination and coherence of our fisheries management. We need to enable fisheries management to be adaptive and suitable to local contexts. We hear a lot about the need for simplicity, but actually that belies the complexity necessitated by local needs. And we also particularly need to ensure that the FMPs incorporate wider environmental and social considerations. Why? Well, coastal fisheries are really important. Over 80% of our commercial fishing fleet is under 10 metres in length. Coastal fisheries are so important to our coastal towns, coastal communities, not just for the employment they create, but for tourism. They're a source of food and also a source of recreation. To support these fisheries, we need to integrate better at a local level fisheries decision-making into our coastal infrastructure and development through locally led strategic investment. Over 50% of our waters are designated as marine protected areas. I'd like to turn to that point now. They're designated in one form or another, and we can be rightly proud actually of the progress made to manage fisheries in our coastal waters over the last decade or so, particularly, I have to say, by the IFCAs. It's not easy. We need to recognise and, dare I say, value the inherent tensions between the valuable social and economic contribution of coastal fisheries with the need to protect the marine ecosystem. We need to protect and value the spaces that we can create to bring different voices together to the decision-making table, and support robust governance structures. This requires investment and requires a move away from the silo decision-making that we've had before. I would argue that the IFCAs are a model for this integration, and local authorities provide such a route. We can, moving to another point, and should bring online new technologies. We hear a lot about new technologies bringing into the fisheries space, but these should build on and not abstract from the management of those effects. We should invest in co-management and community-led decision-making, supported by remote technologies. Our system is necessarily complex, and we need better methods to communicate our management and integrate the multiple layers that we have. We need not be afraid of the complexity, but find ways of communicating more effectively with the wider community the benefits of a well-managed marine environment. To do so, we need more and better monitoring of our marine systems to demonstrate the value of marine protection and fisheries management. And finally, the increased pace of climate change is nowhere more keenly felt than at our coast. As new fisheries develop and others shift and alter, our systems of governance will need to be sufficiently robust and adaptive to adapt to. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Cheers, Rob. Thank you. Great views from all of you there. It's really, really interesting. And what I always find interesting is when we get people together from seemingly diverse areas, actually, I think, as both Benj and Pete and Katie Jo said, we all want the same thing. And what that looks like is a healthy environment, thriving coastal communities, and a means of achieving our targets for net zero. And there are some important things underpinning that. And as I said earlier, I don't think it's necessarily like a technical knowledge problem. Sometimes it's a capacity problem, or a resource problem, or a political will problem, or an integration problem, as you said, Benj. And there's something about how do we, across the areas that we're gonna talk through, what are the things that we think might need to change. And we've got lots of interesting questions in the chat, sort of all around this kind of theme, where we're talking about how do we break down silos, increase coordination, how do we ensure a just transition. We've got some questions on legislation, but they're all the action oriented things. And what we're getting from manifestos is high level policy, because that's what you get from manifestos. So it'd be interesting to think about what are some of those actions that we can take and that we'd be pushing when a new government comes in. We're going to be knocking on their door and saying, we think you should do X, Y, and Z in these areas. The first area we're going to go to, and I'm going to be quite strict about trying to keep to 10 minutes for each of these, because we have 40 minutes left. And the way that we're going to do this is we've got a question. I'm going to come to one person to lead off, but if everyone else can put their hands up, then we can have a conversation. The first theme's around environmental protection and restoration. There are very few of the manifestos that actually put in whole new targets. There are some of them that are talking about a general duty of care for the environment, or rights for nature, but we have a really strong framework for environmental protection and management. And I think looking at freshwater, where you look at the Environment Agency and you look at the number of compliance visits they've done in the last year, as opposed to the number of compliance visits they might have done in 2009, which is like an order of magnitude less. And that's not because the regulatory framework's different, it's because they've got less resource, or the political climate's changed in some way. So my question here is, what do we need to do to deliver on those targets? Is our existing framework good enough? Do we need new things? Or is it just a question of we need better finance and resource, leadership in different ways to meet those targets? And how can we work better in partnership to try and do that? Katie Jo, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Dickon. I think it's probably all of those things you've named, actually. I mean, one of the interesting things for me has been working, and Peter mentioned OWEC, the Offshore Wind Evidence Change Group, has facilitated some really good cross-sector discussions, and there is far more that unites us than divides us. And to some extent, it's been a frustration that even with that level of collaboration and coincidence of interest, we have really failed to manage to turn this into action. And I think we need greater and more courageous political leadership on this, because there are choices to be made. But I think we all see the benefit of being able to improve the planning system by front loading nature, because that will speed it up and give greater certainty to developers. So it's really cracking through what are the actual tangible things that would enable that to happen. And at the moment, we haven't really seen that. And I would love to see that greater leadership in government. I think there's also some pieces, and I mentioned marine protected areas. There hasn't been a bold vision for marine protected areas that we've seen through. We've had lots of consultation on things, but very few new highly protected marine areas have come through in the end. There's very little ambition for new marine protected areas. And there's some real opportunities. So 10 years ago, there was a big collaboration to get rid of rats on Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel. That is now a fantastic success. It is a veritable seabird factory. From 13 puffins, there are 1,300 and something now, and more than 40,000 seabirds breeding, producing hundreds of more seabirds every year. So it's just wonderful success. But it's not protected. I would love to see that become a new protected area. And we need to see this sufficiency review for seabirds at sea. They're only protected when they land, which is really stupid, given that we know how important seabirds are for the marine environment. And then we've ended up in some weird places, like Natural England has produced a really good seabird conservation and recovery pathway document, which DEFRA has said is advice to them. So it lives in this kind of weird no man's land. Any have described what needs to be done. DEFRA have kind of said, oh, well, it's not really our policy, it's just advice to us. And as a result, none of it's being actioned. There's no money being aligned to it. And what we'd love to see is the resources that you've talked about really driving forward these changes. And Rob mentioned some of the willingness in the fishing industry then to embrace some of the remote electronic monitoring. Really exciting that the industry wants to go down that route. And that would really help us, because seabird bycatch, for example, is a big challenge. Every 3 minutes across Europe, we've got a seabird dying in unsuitable fishing gear. None of the fishers want that to happen. None of the conservationists want that to happen. And there's willingness in the offshore industry, if this could buy us more capacity, to help fund it. But again, government hasn't really driven that change. So I think there's a really big role for government to help enable some of these collaborations that are actually bubbling up and being discussed at the kind of partnership level that we have between folk like us on this call. But we need the enabling regulations, the kind of join up to put that into more structures and frameworks that will enable this to happen at scale. So I think there's some really great opportunities for the next government, whoever they are, to kind of to take this willingness to use the challenge we face as a big opportunity to do something different. And to some extent, because there isn't ownership in the same sense that we have on land, we can think a bit more flexibly. And there is a key role for the Crown Estate here, who are letting the leases to drive this, to be a big player in this new approach as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katie Jo. So there's a lot there about restoration and protection as well. And to a large part, the people that may be funding some of that restoration are the marine industries, either Pete or Ben are representing. Pete, I've noticed you've come off. I don't know if there's something you want to talk around there.
I'd support everything that Katie Jo says. You'd expect me to. I kind of want to kick off, and I will keep it brief, Dickon, I promise. I kind of want to kick off by saying, I think we should start by not seeing nature as a byproduct of legislative action, but at the forefront of legislative action. Yeah. Now, I say that from an industry perspective because there isn't an industry in the SUDG that doesn't agree with that. We've talked about it at length. So we've got a biodiversity crisis, we've got a climate crisis. We need to address both. So my underlying thing is nature is not a byproduct. It's not something that happens as a result of. It's something that should be up front. Katie Jo, you and I agree with that, absolutely. let me put that into context of specific bit of legislation. As everybody knows, we're currently looking at how we can address net zero more quickly. And one of the ways of doing that is that DEFRA, fairly reasonably, are looking at the legislation attached to approvals for offshore wind. But we're not doing it across all industries. So the danger of a siloed approach such as that may not only be that we don't have nature completely up front as an output, but we end up with two consenting pathways instead of one consenting pathway for marine industries. I say that as an example, Dickon, because I think it's illustrative of showing that we need to apply pressure and thinking at addressing what we know to be the key drivers. Those are the two issues of climate change and biodiversity crises. So we start with those and we work down from there. We need strategic targets, we need goals, we need to understand, not talk, real clear goals that we can then say, right, how can each of us deliver accordingly, and how can the legislation not hinder but help? I'll stop there, but thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pete. And Benj, I'd be interested to know some of your thoughts around there. You mentioned the Marine Recovery Fund earlier, and there are some other kind of fundamental mechanisms that can help some of that as well, aren't there?
Absolutely, Dickon. And again, we're all violently agreeing with each other, and I wouldn't take issue with anything that Katie, Jo, or Peter has just said. I think it's good to talk about the prime, the fact that we can't just talk about net zero. I think if I look at what I really want to hear from the next government, it is senior ministers, cabinet secretaries talking about biodiversity and climate change in one sentence. I don't think I heard that, because it's that leadership into the departments that will drive a more joined up approach to how our planning legislation works, how the strategic spatial planning will work, how we go through the mechanics of delivering offshore wind, in particular, in my interest. And if I think about the kind of scale of investment that offshore wind is going to take in order to reach net zero, it's in the hundreds of billions of pounds. And we only need to think a little bit about how you could purpose some of that investment to deliver climate change action that also delivers biodiversity outcomes that are improving the situation. Now, it's not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve everything. And I'm bound to say, of course, aren't I? Those of you who know Orsted will know we've set this ambition to have net positive biodiversity impact for all of our projects that we commission from 2030. The reason we're doing that is because we see the interrelation between the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And we need to make offshore wind part of that solution. We genuinely believe we can. Just last week, I think it was, we launched our new biodiversity measurement framework for the marine environment. Urge everyone on this call to have a look, and there's an opportunity for you to comment and raise ideas and challenges on that, so please do. But I think it's just one example where, as an industry, we can do so much because of the scale of what we're doing to tackle climate change. But we need to hear that from government as well. We need to see the mobilisation of our industry to tackle both crises hand in hand. It's absolutely doable, but we need those clear political signals. There's a lot of very practical stuff that I can come on to later. We've got the Marine Recovery Fund. We've got the Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Plan. We've mentioned ecosystems. Peter and Katie Jo both mentioned the need to take an ecosystems approach. Absolutely. If I just as one example before I finish, Dickon, think about Kittiwake, and we're doing a lot as an offshore wind developer with our most recent projects to provide solutions for the impacts of development on Kittiwake. But we need much more joined up approach. Kittiwake need food, they need sand eels. So just as one little example, we have to be we have to take a much more joined up approach, and I think that has to come from government and ministerial leadership.
That point of ministerial leadership is really important, Benj. And I've heard Rory Stewart talk on his podcast about wanting to have a commitment from the next government that ministers will be in post for at least 2 years, to allow for that leadership. And I was just, while you were talking, since 2010, in 13 years, we've had 11 different secretaries of state and 5 different secretaries of state in the last 5 years. And that's political leadership. If it's changing all the time, makes all the good work that the civil servants are doing quite hard, because you're getting a new boss the whole time. And there's something about, just people being in post, an environment being seen as an important political portfolio as well, potentially.
Just to come back on that political leadership point, I think, I've been working in this space for 15 years, and one of the things I've learned is there's no such thing as government. There are just government departments. And without being pejorative about the people that have led them or the people that work in them, they have priorities, they have ambitions that reflect the brief of that department, which is why I mentioned earlier, it's so important that we have this joining up somewhere, and I'm really not fussed where that is. Is it in cabinet? Is it somewhere else? We've got to start setting clear goals and then a policy framework underneath those goals that isn't siloed into individual departments. I mean, even with the planning reforms that we're doing with DEFRA, with DLO, with DESNES, already that's very challenging, and we need that leadership above individual departments. That will, I genuinely believe, will really unlock progress and pace, because as I've said at the beginning, we've got to accelerate what's being done here, both for the environment and for net zero.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to let this conversation go for another couple of minutes. We've got Pete wants to say something, and then Katie Jo wants to come in. Rob and Becky, I appreciate you haven't spoken for a bit, so what I might do is move some of the coastal communities questions up next, so we can have an opportunity to hear you as well. Pete.
Very quickly, we had a marine policy statement in 2010, I think. It was, to be blunt, motherhood and apple pie. We need a restated marine policy statement. It needs to reflect marine spatial prioritisation. It needs to have clear objectives, and it needs to set those targets, as Benj said, across departments, so that we can all work to common targets. Whether we have a marine minister or not, questionable, but if we had a marine policy statement that made clear commitment to set objectives, everybody could work to those. That for us is a priority, and it's why marine spatial prioritisation is so important, to get that body of information to be able to build into a marine policy statement. I'll stop.
Do you know what, Pete? I was talking the other day, we do, in my day job, we do quite a lot of work in the developing world, and the first thing that we do when we go to a government that doesn't have integrated decision making is say, you need a joint vision about where you're going.
Correct.
And yeah, you're right. I remember working on that with you back in 2010, and it feels like that's sort of dropped away a bit. So revitalizing that, I completely agree, is a great idea. Katie Jo.
Yeah, well, I would heartily agree, and having it on the same footing as the national policy statements for energy as well would really help with that integration. I was going to bring us into a slightly different area as well, which is really around, if ministers own this agenda as a challenge that we need to bring together, there's a real need to kind of focus on outcomes and quality. So the next government will own the target for the Environment Act targets around nature restoration and species recovery, because we've got to meet those by 2030. So there's a real focus on how do we deliver, even within our protected area network, for example, how do we make sure they're being managed really well? We've still got some of the most damaging fisheries activity happening within our marine protected areas. So, I think we really need that kind of bold ambition to drive quality of change as well, and that kind of focus on the outcome.
Great, thanks, Katie Jo. Becky.
Yeah, just a really quick one from me. We're non-partisan as a group, even though we've got 58 coastal councils. We don't know who has control over what. That's how we operate. That's why we've operated the APPG within Parliament. We don't care who comes from what. And one thing that we've seen, the thing with all the points are very relevant that everyone's been mentioning, but this political will is, it's really frustrating if you politicise the climate crisis and you politicise nature, recovery, biodiversity loss, it doesn't matter what party you belong to, it's happening to everybody. And I think that's where local authorities have really been kind of shining a light on what can be done, but not just local authorities. We've had, there's something called the Motion for the Ocean, and that was co-developed by 3 co-authors, and that sort of is a symbol of how you can bring different people together, different parties together. We've got, I think, 28 local councils who signed up to it, including the Local Government Association. Those are all sorts of layers of councils. They're going from parish, town, districts, county, city, inland councils, ones on the coast, are all declaring a motion for the ocean unanimously, because as a council, they recognise the issues that are being felt locally and their local impacts on the wider area. So for us, it's really difficult when things get politicised, because what's happening with seabirds, what's happening with fisheries, it's happening to everybody. It doesn't matter who you support.
Beccy, I'm going to move us on to coastal communities now, so I'll be interested to hear from you and Rob a little bit. Just on that, I think you made a really good point about climate and nature shouldn't be politicised, but the response to it often is in terms of how you prioritise it against other spending, effectively. There's something that's really interesting, and there was a comment in the questions about this, about when we're going through change and the societal change that's needed, whether that's a switch from one industry to the other or just doing things different ways, how do we ensure a just transition in that change? And that's a phrase that's used a lot north of the border and not very much south of the border. And what kind of mechanisms do we need to support coastal communities in that change? And the thing I always find fascinating in that is that, again, I refer to some of the work we do in the developing world, where, again, one of the first things that we'll do when we'll go in and talk to administrations is say, what's your planning at sea? What's your planning at land? And how are you integrating those things? We've almost forgotten the term integrated coastal zone management, and we're not going to get into that conversation because we don't have a lot of time. But I'd just be really interesting to know the thoughts of you and Rob about how we better join up across the land sea interface, and how do we make sure communities aren't left behind in that?
Yeah, I think that's where IFCAs, as I'm sure Rob will point out in a minute, are a really good model of how you bring people together from different areas to talk about one issue, but also think of it in a non-siloed way. Mm-hmm. Yes, integrated coastal zone management. We've been banging on about this for 25 years and it's still not happening. And it's really difficult because, as I say, marine and coast are seen as difficult. It's on the periphery. It is difficult to get things there. We've got some councils who can't even get tarmac to replace the road, to repair their road, because the tarmac company has moved 10 miles more inland, and now the tarmac will be dry by the time it reaches the road. We have all these sorts of different issues going on, but they are all intertwined together. And I think we have this situation at the moment where we've got these golden opportunities, but quite often communities come back to me and say, we've been told 3,000 jobs are going to be made. There's this whole new thing happening, but how many of those are local jobs? How are we going to get upskilled so that we can get those jobs? Or is it 3,000 people who are going to be brought in from different places, and then they deliver this project, and then those 3,000 people go off and go and do a job somewhere else? So it's not actually 3,000 people in the local community, but we've also got this issue where people in the local community don't feel those jobs are for them. So we have this, quite difficult disparity, and that's why we want to try and bring all these different people around the table for these different aspects and say, right, how do we actually, what are the issues? How can we deliver them? And we've talked a lot about legislation. Legislation's really static in some areas. And, it isn't so much around, the IFCAs really show how you can have policies and things that have a bit of flexibility to them and change over time. But a lot of legislative process is really static. and they say, oh, we'll review it in 3 years' time, but you find a problem with it 2 months down the line, but you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not helping things. I mean, one of our biggest frustrations at the moment is, where's the Coastal Communities Fund gone? It's been sucked up into the Shared Prosperity Fund, but we don't know where it's gone, because that money is not going back to coastal communities.
Yeah.
So, you know, we have all these sort of interesting things going on. And I'll be quiet now because I'm sure Rob's got a lot to say as well.
Yeah, thanks, Beccy. And Rob, I think what I'm going to try and do, because I want to come back to talk a bit more about net zero. But so I think in your reflections on this, if you could think about some of the things that Beccy talked about, but in particular what that means for fisheries, I guess, and coastal communities, if you feel like you can talk in and around any of that.
Thank you. Yeah, the thing that's jumped out at me there was the, you know, in England, we have one of the most centralized systems of decision making anywhere else, so anywhere in Europe. There is a lot of value in community-led local development. Whilst on the one hand, we need, you know, centralized policy, the legislative drivers to implement marine protections are absolutely necessary. But the intricate detail of making that so in the muddy backwater of a small coastal town, where it affects some people very significantly and done properly, can really, you know, support nature recovery and wildlife and reconcile those issues, can only be done at the local level. So I've always got Professor Peter Jones in my mind when his sort of doctrines of, you know, bottom up and top down. We need to integrate better our bottom-up decision making into and really enable them to deliver these policies. We've seen some really good examples of where that works. I don't think it's valued enough. I would like to see that valued more as we go forward and really given the tools and resources that are necessary. And that's why in my opening piece, I really sort of tried to emphasize we need to value the space where these inherent tensions can be worked through at local community level. By supporting those with community-led local development, we could also match the transitions that are necessary to make the changes with resources to enable transition. I think all of which are possible. We have the systems, we have the tools, we just need to build upon them, and in so doing, we will break down the silos that we have. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. So we've got a quarter of an hour left, and I would like to have a bit of a chat around net zero. We've touched on this in various kind of ways. So the different parties we've got: decarbonise by 2030 from the Greens, Labour hit net zero by 2030, Lib Dems by 2045, Conservatives by 2050. I guess we want to do this as quickly as possible, but there are challenges, and they aren't just consenting challenges. There are supply chain challenges and financing challenges in and around that as well. Within that, we've got lots of comments in the text about how we do marine planning properly, how important the Marine Recovery Fund or SMEF in Scotland and the Emerging Fund in Wales are going to be for those. Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is how fast is fast enough is going to be as fast as we can. But then the question is, other than that, is how fast can we go? And Benj, I'd be really interested to get some of your thoughts around that.
Thanks, Dickon. Big question. I will try and be brief. How fast is fast enough? It is as fast as we can go, whilst delivering on the joint ambition of tackling net zero and reversing biodiversity loss. We absolutely can't do one without the other, not least because our mandate to operate as an offshore wind industry is built on being a little bit wider thinking than just building our wind farms and moving on to the next one. We have to take that more holistic approach, to use a horrible word. But I think there are some really practical things that we can talk about here that we've seen progress being made on. I've mentioned the Marine Recovery Fund. We absolutely need to see that rolled out. I know it's supposed to be coming later this year. We cannot afford that to be delayed. It's absolutely vital that we get the Marine Recovery Fund up and running, that we're able to deliver the strategic compensation that's coming through the library of measures. It's quite a small library at the moment, but it's growing. We need to press ahead with things like MPA extensions that will enable benthic challenges to be properly addressed in a strategic way, not a tactical way. I think you mentioned right at the beginning, Dickon, the resourcing, human resourcing challenge. We absolutely need to see quick action on that. I'm trying to be quite practical now about what is going to enable the net zero journey. It's setting the right frame with environment, but then it is delivering these tools. It is enabling organisations like Natural England to have the capacity, for example, to continue with service level agreements. We've had one. It's not been possible to extend it because they simply don't have the resources to deliver it. It's not their fault. We've got to address this capacity and capability aspect because it means better outcomes, faster outcomes, more predictable outcomes. We saw in the British Energy Security Strategy from April, was it last year? I think it was, that there's a very clear connection in government thinking across environment and net zero, but the turning of those ideas into outcomes needs to accelerate. I think the whole ecosystem thing we've kind of touched on. I would love, as I've said earlier, to see my industry get more active, doing work to deliver on this ambition of joining up net zero and biodiversity loss. Absolutely possible, but we also can't do it on its own. We need the whole industry to jump into this space, and I really hope that with the right leadership from government and the right tools in the toolbox, both in terms of how space is allocated, which of course, as you said, Katie Jo, is down to the 2 Crown estates, but also how we drive innovation, because we haven't really spoken at all about innovation, and government has a big role to play in terms of driving the innovation that's going to enable this these 2 journeys to become one, and then both journeys hand in hand to accelerate.
Great, thanks, Benj. Katie Jo.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much that we agree on. It's really, really, hopefully, if there are any politicians watching this would feel like an exciting opportunity to lean into. 2 things that just building on what Ben said. In terms of innovation, nature inclusive design feels like a really important area for us to kind of build upon and get those standards really embedded, so they, rather than being the kind of unusual examples of best practice, they become the bog standard practice for all of our delivery. And the other bit for me goes back to this spatial allocation of the sea. There's a question in the chat about, do we have time for marine spatial planning? We need to crack on with this, and I do agree. We've got to start working with what we've got now, but we also need to plan ahead. So it is always worth doing spatial planning, in my view. But you have got to adapt and bring in new data as you go. And the Crown Estate in south of the border, anyway, is doing work on a whole of the seabed approach, which is a really positive approach to building a more comprehensive data set. But at the moment, we haven't seen all the environmental data yet going into that, and that still feels like a critical bit. And I'm very keen that they don't release it in stages, because then we're back to square one. We're really keen that they build in all of the ecological data, and that can be quite iterative, because some of that sea is already allocated and there are consents in progress, but we can use new information coming in to help those wind farm developers look at how they compensate and what the strategic compensation opportunities are. So I think we can be iterative and take this adaptive management approach as well. So I think I'm really supportive of those areas in terms of innovation as well.
Thanks, Katie Jo. And I like your comment about this being an exciting opportunity for politicians to lean into. I agree with you. So Pete and Beccy, and then we're going to be getting towards the end, I think. So I'm going to wrap up, if that's okay, Pete.
I'd like to go back to innovation. We all agree, this is an incredibly exciting time for us all to be involved. We're all agreed that we need to work together in partnership, etc. The opportunities for innovation are enormous. I mean, we're a very inventive society. you know, we've got loads of marine science that we should be applying. What we need to accompany that appetite for innovation is legislation that allows it to happen. If legislation remains constricting, industries will go for those bits of net gain, strategic compensation, whatever, that the legislation allows. That will reduce the opportunity of things that we can do. It will reduce the opportunities for innovation. So innovation, absolutely. Let's really think excitedly about how we can restore the environment, but let's have the legislation which supports that as well. That's absolutely critical to me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Pete. Beccy.
Yeah, just to sort of finish up on that, I think me and Peter will be thinking of very different types of innovation, but for us, it's kind of how do you be innovative about bringing communities along this journey and really talking to them, not just when the plans are already well developed, because we are seeing some really difficult situations with some of our communities. They're already becoming climate refugees, but they're not being appreciated for that situation and the fact that our energy needs have led to those accelerated changes in sea level rise and storminess, and they don't feel they're being adequately compensated for that. But also, consultation processes are just not friendly to the general public. There needs to be innovative ways about having pre-consultation discussions, all those different elements to bring it along. And we do need adaptive legislation so that we can learn and really go at pace, at a scale that really helps everybody, so that it helps those silos. And we've all been talking about funding and how we need resource and capacity. There isn't enough resource, there isn't enough capacity, but there's only one cake. So how do we split that money up? How do we use it in the right way? You know, it's a really difficult challenge, I think, for anybody. But we do really need a massive shift in resource and capacity into marine and coast, and also the terrestrial fringe, to bring the three together to really deliver for everybody.
Great, thank you, Beccy. Rob, would you like to make a comment just before we close up? I'm conscious we've been round the room.
No, I'm very, very happy just to listen to Beccy make those points about investing in our coast. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to finish just to reflect on two of the last questions that have come through. One's about a lot of talk about the need for strong ministerial leadership, and are we confident that we're going to get it? We can hope that we're going to get it, I guess.
I think we have to create it.
Yes.
Actually.
Yeah, you have to empower
we can't
them
just
to
sit
be
here and say
confident
this is what we want.
Yeah.
It's our job to go and make that happen.
Yeah, giving those politicians the confidence that they are making the right decision to some degree, and isn't it, Bench, about supporting them and helping them do the right thing. And there was another point about, whilst the discussion of what we'd like to see is nice, which party is closest to delivering these goals? Well, I went through the manifestos at the beginning, and that might seem like a long time ago now, but I think the discussion we've had today has been about making sure that we are delivering net zero and nature recovery together, putting nature at the heart of our decision making, getting better collaboration across sectors and government departments, and making sure that amongst all of that, our coastal communities are fully involved in that decision making. And I will leave it to you to go and do what I've done over the last week, to go and download all the manifestos and word search for coast and sea and ocean and marine. And so all that's left for me to say is that this recording will be available on the OCF website. So if you want to tell your friends who missed it to come along and have a look, that'd be great. We haven't had a huge amount of talk about fisheries today. We are in the background. My colleagues at OCF are talking to people in the fishing community, and we're hoping to have another one of these that's focused just on fishing in the next couple of weeks. And we would have had representatives from the fishing industry, and I think Rob's here representing the fisheries regulator rather than industry, but they couldn't make it today, so we're going to do them separately. So it really just is left for me to say thank you very much to Beccy, Rob, Katie, Joe, Benj, and Pete for coming along at really, really short notice, and having such a fascinating discussion. It's been really, really useful. And as much as I started on a quite sort of doom and gloom narrative of where we are, hopefully everyone can see there is a lot of enthusiasm and recognition of opportunity in the room if we choose to take it, I guess. So yes, thank you to everybody, and thank you to everybody for coming, and yeah, we will yes, carry on these conversations, no doubt, in the future.